Today we're taking a vivid, sexy, and titillating journey into the steamy underworld of the dime novel. In the scandalous world of pulp fiction in the 1950s and 60s, detectives, gangsters, and mad doctors were joined on the racks by bad girls, dissolute youths, drug-crazed beatniks, and other assorted miscreants and misfits. Where romance met with soft porn, there was also a surprisingly large population of butch brunettes pursuing and seducing blonde femmes. This was an alternate universe of erotic pulp fiction where gals were exploring the illicit pleasures of lesbian love, much to the delight of a largely male, heterosexual readership. Before the sexual revolution of the 1960s, these books offered a thrilling peek into the deviant underworld of wild passion and scandalous sex. These books sizzle with sexual energy and freedom in a high-camp defiance of the prudish, conservative 1950s. The covers were bold, kitschy, colorful, and fraught with sexual tension. The women within their pages are larger than life. Their desire is in plain sight. They own the predatory lesbian trope and never look back. Many of these books were written by men using female pseudonyms and were illustrated by cover artists who never read the content between the covers. However, a good percentage were written by women, many of whom were lesbians themselves. For lesbians across the country, especially those living isolated lives in small towns, these books provided a sense of community they never knew existed, a connection to women who experienced the same longings, feelings, and fears as they did, the powerful knowledge that they were not alone. Publishers likely never intended any of these books to tumble into the hands of impressionable young women, and certainly not those about lesbian love. A publishing revolution in the 1940s had put millions of inexpensive paperbacks in the pockets of soldiers. Named after the cheap pulp paper from which they were made, pulp fiction became the literature of the working class. The books offered as many racy subgenres as there were sexual proclivities, all marketed to the men who had now come back from the war. They were cheap and disposable, designed to be read and tossed out. Yet the most successful among them sold in the hundreds of thousands or even the millions, and many of these were lesbian pulps. In burgeoning lesbian communities, pulp novels were treasured and passed from person to person. But for those who didn't have a queer social circle, the books were perhaps even more valuable. In a 1983 essay in the lesbian magazine On Our Backs, Roberta Yusba writes, "The pulps also reached isolated small-town lesbians who could read them and see that they were not the only lesbians in the world."
There was a golden age of lesbian writing and publishing that came to pass in the 50s and 60s. And I think that we suddenly reached out and connected with women who were very isolated and sequestered almost in little towns across the country. I think maybe that's one reason why the paperback originals, which did deal with a lesbian theme, became so valuable to so many women. They were widely distributed, and they said, this is how it is, this is who some of your sisters are.
It's no coincidence that around the time that Dr. Alfred Kinsey of Kinsey Scale fame had published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and shortly thereafter Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, a whole new nationwide public interest picked up significantly in what exactly these gays were up to when they were getting busy, especially women. Unfortunately for those burgeoning lesbians and bisexuals hoping to be affirmed that they weren't alone in their desires, the United States Congress moved to ban lesbian themes from fiction shortly thereafter, citing that publishers must adhere to stricter moral standards. Publishers were quick to find loopholes in the morality ruling. With these creative solutions, though, came the price of having to compromise the happiness and often the safety of the characters that they were selling the stories of. The way these stories pondered hands and lips and illustrated their touch was only permitted if the characters were eventually put in their place. Anne Bannon recalled in 2012, "In order to shut up Senator McCarthy and all of the morality cops, they had to be punished. The post office would not deliver the books unless one of the women had committed suicide, gone nuts, or been killed."
I think women writing in the 50s and 60s for the paperback houses in particular were often constrained by the kind of formula that the publisher imposed on them. There was some kind of retribution that was essential at the end so that you could let them have a little fun in the meantime and presumably entertain the reader. But it was not to go unpunished. So at the end of a story like that, one of the women or both had to die or be essentially shipped out of the country or undergo some calamity that would break her heart or break her spirit or end her life. If there was one good thing that came out of Gold Medal books leaving me to my own devices, I think it was that I didn't have to do that. My women survived. They loved hard and they lost hard, but they won a few and they didn't die.
In order to escape the idea of characters fully portraying the lesbian experience or proselytizing homosexuality, the so-called straying women would often meet a grim fate at the end of the novel, or instead find herself the right man who would whisk her away from her sinful thoughts, giving rise to the bury your gays trope, in which a queer character must either die or receive an unhappy ending because of their sexuality.
The books were displayed with the other books, with mysteries and westerns and everything, and you had to dig for them. The only way you could identify them was by the pictures on the cover. As soon as I'd see a picture of two women, I'd say, oh yeah, this has to be one. Grab. It's great.
I don't remember all the authors, I just remember all the books, and there were tons of them, and they all had great covers. Very suggestive and entrancing. I got involved with a friend, and she had come across all these wonderful novels, these lesbian novels, and she said, I'd like you to read this book. And then she gave me one, and then she gave me another one, and then she gave me another one. By now I was sort of getting hooked on the stories. And at some point she sort of confessed, well, I think I'm like that. And I totally freaked out, and I said, oh no, not like that. But eventually I sort of thought, maybe I'm like that too. Ultimately, we got it together, and I just left my husband and sort of took on a new life.
Many of the women who read these books and came out to their peers in the 1960s and 70s never told their families, dodging questions for decades about their apparent singledom and lack of children. The author Lee Lynch remembers going from one section to the next in libraries and bookstores in pursuit of some kind of literary mirror. I was driven, she wrote in an essay, searching for my nourishment like a starveling, grabbing at any crumb that looked, tasted, or smelled digestible. By the age of 15, she says, our self-image was already, you're a criminal and sick and rejects, you're societal rejects. To find anything about ourselves was extremely exciting. The Pulps weren't like that. Their messages might have been mixed, but they acknowledged feelings these young women had without writing them off. In her introduction to lesbian pulp fiction, Catherine Forrest describes the books as life-saving. In some cases, this was literally true. Bannon recalls a young woman who later became a good friend. She had reached a point of absolute despair, she told Bannon, and planned to throw herself off the bridge that ran through her city. Then, on the day she decided to do it, she passed a drugstore and saw Odd Girl Out, Bannon's 1957 novella, on the shelves. She bought it, sat down, read the whole thing, and then went home for dinner. You hear things like that and it just turns your heart over. I don't know how many there were who went through that, but that anyone should have gone home for dinner instead of jumping off the bridge, says Bannon, her voice catching. Oh my goodness, I mean, you never get over that. The impact of that representation was tremendous. Lesbian pulp novels appear again and again in lesbian memoirs and personal essays, always with the same mingling of pleasure and pain. In Kate Millett's 1974 autobiography, she describes herself hoarding them because they were the only books where one woman kissed another, touched her, transported to read finally in a book what had been the dearest part of my experience recognized at last in print. She hid them away in a drawer until she left the country for Japan. Afraid the sublet might find them, I burned them before I set out. In Anne Bannon's Odd Girl Out, college gal Laura feels too pretty to be experiencing queer desire. She looked down at herself and nothing seemed wrong. She wore lipstick and curled her hair, the author writes. Her brow, the crook in her arms, the fit of her legs, everything was feminine. From the blurb, she was the brain, the sparkle, the gay rebel voice of the sorority, and wonder of wonders, she chose Laura as her roommate. Suddenly, the distance between them closed and they were alone on an island of forbidden bliss. Despite the story ending with one of the girls in a straight relationship, there is one glimmer of hope. The other remains a lesbian and still gets to live. What a treat! Catherine Forrest describes chancing upon Anne Bannon's Odd Girl Out for sale in 1957. I did not need to look at the title for clues. The cover leapt out at me from the drugstore rack. Overwhelming need led me to walk a gauntlet of fear up to the cash register. Fear so intense that I remember nothing more, only that I stumbled out of the store in possession of what I knew I must have, a book as necessary to me as air. Women didn't have to look far for their fix. America's drugstores and airport bookstores sold lesbian pulp fiction quite openly. The novels were displayed cheek to jowl with stories of alien invasions and Nazi torture. Pulp novels had tawdry titles, conspicuous covers, and taglines that promised readers everything from the sex traps of vacationing she-wolves to a glimpse into the intimate sex needs of America's 900,000 young widows. Odd Girl Out would go on to be the publisher's second best-selling title of 1957. It launched a series of 6 books, later known as the Bebo Brinker Chronicles, after their charismatic heroine, who shows up in New York at 18 and finds her way there as a butch lesbian. Throughout this time, Bannon was living a kind of double life, split between married life in Pennsylvania and occasional week-long visits to see friends in Greenwich Village. Hearing her talk about these visits, you get the sense that they were as much to research the books, as she told her husband, as they were an exploration into what could be, what alternatives she might have had. Her husband never read the books, and only really reconciled himself to them when they began bringing in significant amounts of money. Bannon remembers tense evenings typing away with the children in bed while her husband sat in the other room and watched television. Eventually, the marriage broke down, and Bannon abandoned her writing career for the good of her children, and a successful career in academia.
My family, my life, my culture, my society all said be a good wife and mother. And I gave it a long run and a good try, and it finally didn't work. And so I'm living a much better life. I'm much truer to myself now, but you can't go back and rewrite it.
It took a lot of courage to be what we were. Like, these were all courageous women. We were all out there flaunting the law and just being brave enough to do what we were doing, with no support, with no help from anybody.
The books, Bannon says, are a product of their environment, and of a time when people were under colossal stress from constant marginalization, a cultural context in which straight people genuinely believed that their LGBT peers had perversely chosen and pursued their lives to defy the norms of those around them.
And then they'd find ways in the cover blurbs to say, must society reject me, or this kind of very obvious, none too subtle clue. They didn't want it to be subtle. They wanted people to know right away that they were buying something that had to do with a lesbian theme.
The re-release of the pulps in 1980 brought that tension to the fore. Some 1980s readers thought of the pulps with tremendous affection, certainly, but others saw them as a vestige of a more unhappy time, with a roaring undercurrent of homophobia just barely out of sight. The journalist Joy Parks, in one 1980s review, describes her teeth being set on edge by their apoliticism, and the way these women are constantly referred to as girls. These romances have a genuine, down-to-earth, life in the raw quality, plus love scenes that appear very fresh and, I hate to say it, rather sweet in their innocence and lack of graphic detail, she writes. But the fringe life of the lesbian of the 50s and 60s lacked something vital: self-love, pride, dignity. Around the same time, the writer Andrea Lowenstein, who had loved the books in her youth, struggled to respond to friends who found them boring and badly written. Other acquaintances she wrote were angered and upset by them and the bitter past they represented. But ignoring that challenging recent history, she writes, borders on revisionism. It is important for us as readers to remember that other lesbian writers were drawing different conclusions from the same life evidence, Lowenstein concludes. But it is also important to understand and to bear witness to the kind of pain which is beyond the cliched writing in these pulp novels. This pain and self-hatred is not our only past, but it is a part of it. In Claire Morgan's 1952 The Price of Salt, the heroine leaves her husband and loses custody of her child to be with her lover. A male reviewer at the Times called it pretty unexciting, though he was likely far from its intended readership. Instead of ending in tragedy, Therese and Carol get to have the happiness long denied to the other characters of their time. If it sounds familiar to you, that's because the novel serves as the basis for the iconic 2015 film Carol, starring Cate Blanchett. In the best cases, the books weren't just proof that lesbians existed, but that they could be proud of who they were and what they wanted. 10 years before Stonewall, Artemis Smith's 1959 novel Odd Girl shows the confrontation with the hero Anne and her father. "No daughter of mine is going to be a lesbian," he said the word with intense hate. "I'm afraid you have nothing to say about that," Anne said quietly. "I am what I am." "You're a victim of this awful woman," her father sputtered. "She has you hypnotized." "No, Dad," Anne continued quietly. "I have always been this way. I won't be changed by you or anyone else. This is the first time my life has really felt bright and happy." "You are breaking the laws of nature," her father said. "The law I'm breaking is against nature," Anne returned strongly. "The law will have to be changed." But not every book was quite so affirming, nor quite so radical. The ones by men made no real effort to reach female readers, and even women writers were at the behest of their publishers, who forced them to introduce sad endings. Readers, they said, didn't want to see these women happy and fulfilled by their lesbian dalliances. By the time Bannon was writing, she says, the pressure had lessened only a little. She wasn't required to kill off her protagonists, at least, but giving them a happy ending was virtually unfathomable. All of this, Lynch writes, had a somewhat ambivalent effect on both her developing pride and her self-esteem. On the one hand, the books were validating, insofar as they acknowledged the existence of lesbians. On the other hand, they left little room for hope. The characters were more miserable than Sartre's, and despised as well. The lesbian novels written by men have largely been lost to time. Satan Was a Lesbian, existing in the mustier corners of the internet as a PDF scan, can be traced back to Publishers Export Company, a defunct house that mostly produced adorably titled pulps for gay men like Glory Hole and Queens of the Quarter. Lesbianism was such a popular theme for pulp, one writer explained to the New York Times in September 1965, because the reader gets two immoral women for the price of one. For many readers, this may have been the case. Certainly, a significant portion of the books were as homophobic as their covers. Set in women's dorm rooms or prisons, a significant portion are steamy, quote, true accounts written by men with women's pseudonyms, and marketed as cheap thrills to male readers. But perhaps 50 titles were written by women for women. The scholar Yvonne Keller calls these pro-lesbian, as opposed to the more common virile adventure. The pro-lesbian novels are the ones that changed women's lives, and in so doing passed the test of time. These authors wrote for women, and it showed. I did hope women would find them and read them, says Bannon. I wasn't quite sure enough of my skill or ability to reach them, or even how widely the books were distributed, to hope that they would do some good in the world, but I certainly had that in the back of my mind. In fact, she says, she scarcely thought about her male audience, and so was blindsided by her publisher's choice of cover illustration. The characters within were complex and three-dimensional, but those on the covers were either waifish and gambling or large-breasted and heavy-lidded with passion. That artwork was meant to draw in men through prurient interest, she says, a far cry from her original intent. But if as many men had not bought them, she says, they might never have been so widely disseminated, or have fallen into the hands of the people who needed them the most. An often overlooked and unfortunate truth of lesbian pulp from this era is that it was written and marketed primarily to white queer women, to the extent that it was marketed to women at all. Pre-Stonewall pulp was about as diverse as a Trump rally, with most persons of color, most often black women, used as props for the experimenting white lesbian. Even the exceptions to the rules, such as Rhea Michaels' How Dark My Love, which openly acknowledges and supports the civil rights movement and the pain of its black characters, end on a note of making sure it's clear that interracial relationships are a thing of immorality, maybe even more so than homosexuality. For young women of color of this era, the solace of being seen was likely something even further of a dream than it was for the white queer women who made up the assumed majority pulp audience. With the birth of the lesbian pulp novel, women who loved women could finally see themselves, their experiences, and their lives represented within the pages of a book. They finally had a literature they could call their own. Of course, that's not what the publishers of the day intended. These books were written primarily for men, indeed, shamelessly packaged and published to titillate the male reading public. But for many women of the 1950s and 60s, these slim paperbacks were pivotal and sometimes even life-saving. Within their pages lay physical proof that they were not entirely alone in the world. It was an era of just incredible isolation. A lot of us grew up thinking we were the only ones. The books were like water in the desert. In 1983, the lesbian publisher Naiad Press reprinted a selection of the best lesbian pulp novels. Bannon's were among them. These books were cherished not necessarily for their literary value, but as an early blueprint for lesbian life, all centered around a utopian Greenwich Village. Without older lesbians or bisexual women within their community, lesbian pulp fiction was often the only model women had. And while the books weren't perfect, they were significantly better than the vacuum that had preceded them. The novels have two important legacies. First, they showed lesbians that hope and community were possible. Second, they helped to kickstart a rich tradition of lesbian writing. As a teenager, Lynch loved these books, writing down cherished passages on yellow note cards. She still has them today. As an adult, she says, they instilled in her a commitment to writing books that could inspire lesbians in a way that she had never had. The books were bombarding you with negative stereotypes, she says, but inside I was in love with my girlfriend. We were really proud of being gay. Though it may have started with troubled heroines who were doomed to suicide, misery, the loss of a child, or marriage, the same was not true for many of their readers. Instead, these sad stories were simply a prologue to their own happy ones. To this day, the cover art of these vintage paperback books are just as sought after as the books themselves were 60 years ago. On Etsy, you can buy Tudor from Lesbos coasters, dance hall dyke prints, and a flying lesbian light switch. It's now possible to decorate an entire apartment with books that devoted readers once actively hid behind the fridge, in shoe boxes in the closets, and under mattresses. If millennials have a lesbian pulp equivalent, a cheap bit of entertainment that has strict rules but provides a bit of bliss, it is television. Specifically the queer representation in primetime dramas and reality TV that aired during the 2000s. A Shot at Love with Tila Tequila was my introduction to bisexuality, for better or worse, because it turns out that Tila Tequila is a Nazi sympathizer. Whether it was Alex and Marissa in the OC or Emily and Naomi in Skins, I was hooked on any representation I could find of myself. However, these sapphic plotlines were inevitably thwarted by the writers, because lesbians just cannot have a happy ending. It's physically impossible. I'm extremely grateful that representation in media has progressed beyond that point in the years since then, and that young people today have a lot more positive queer role models to look up to.
I think when I was first writing, it was hard to think of us as a community. It was hard to have a sense that you were in a like-minded group. Mostly, I think, women who were inclined to identify with other women were isolated. They didn't know how to connect. They didn't know where other people were. And one of the things that I think happened as a result of the lesbian pulps that were being written back then was that they could be found anywhere. You could be living in the Midwest in an isolated town without any social support and with no other source of information, but you could find those lesbian pulps on the same shelf with the pulp westerns, the science fiction, the cops and robbers, the romance and the fantasy. And there they were. The lesbian pulps that was why they were so important. We were not the quality books. We had the sleazy covers, which of course made the books sell by the millions and millions. They had a very important role to play. There wasn't much going on in the movies except stories that condemned homosexuality or that ended badly for everybody. So the other media weren't providing the needed outlet, really. And the quality fiction there was some, not to discount that, but it didn't find the same kind of audience. It actually saved lives. And of course the pulps faded because that social temblor was actually already moving. That wave was starting to cross the landscape. And so, the work we were doing was not so much life-saving or necessary as the decades moved on. People still love them and collect them and learn from them as history and enjoy them. And to know you were part of that and maybe part of the first wave that got it going, and to still be here in the new century, wow, that's a gift.
Lesbian author, activist, and historian Jill Nestle said it best, explaining that, in whatever towns or cities these books were read, they were spreading the information that meant a new hope for trapped and isolated women. Even the sleaziest, most cautionary, most demeaning, and most misogynistic story was something treasured, something that many queer women kept stashed in the back of their sock drawer, knowing that it was a piece of them in the world, and that was at least a really good start. Thank you all so much for watching. Subscribe if you want to see more queer content. I'll catch you guys in the next one.